When you hear the name Plato, what comes to mind? Maybe it's the image of an ancient Greek philosopher, a towering intellectual figure, whose thoughts have shaped not just the course of Western philosophy, but the very foundation of how we understand knowledge, justice, and reality. Perhaps you think of the famous allegory of the cave, or his theory of forms, where he presents a vision of a perfect, unchanging world beyond the imperfect, ever-changing one we live in. Maybe you remember him as the teacher of Aristotle, one of the greatest philosophers to ever live. Plato is, without a doubt, one of the most influential figures in intellectual history. Some would even argue that Western philosophy is essentially just a series of footnotes to his work. His ideas have had a lasting impact on everything from politics to metaphysics, influencing philosophers, scientists, and politicians for over 2 millennia. In fact, his work is so foundational that modern Western thought could hardly be imagined without it. But as with any thinker of such profound influence, there's much more to his legacy than just admiration and reverence. Some of his ideas, while revolutionary in their time, have not aged well. In fact, they can seem downright strange, or even harmful, when viewed through the lens of our modern sensibilities. And that's exactly what makes Plato so fascinating. His philosophy is a mix of brilliance and blind spots, a portrait of a mind that sought to understand the world in the most profound ways, but one that was, like all humans, limited by the cultural, social, and scientific constraints of his era. Plato's vision of a perfect world, where philosopher-kings rule in harmony, is one of the earliest political utopias in history, a bold proposal that still resonates in political theory today. But alongside this, his views on women, his ideas about the ideal society, and his theory of the soul, when taken to their logical extremes, can seem bizarre, outdated, and even dangerously authoritarian. So, what's the truth about Plato? Is he a philosopher to be followed unquestioningly, a sage whose ideas continue to light the way for humanity? Or is he someone whose theories, when taken too literally, can lead us down some dark, unexamined paths? The answer, as you might expect, is more complicated. Plato's legacy is a paradox. It's not just about the idealized version of him that we often encounter in philosophy classes, but also about the controversial aspects of his thinking that we often overlook or brush aside. In this video, we're going to take you on a journey through Plato's ideas, both the brilliant and the deeply flawed. You'll learn about his vision of the perfect society, the concept of the philosopher-king, and his radical ideas about justice and knowledge. We'll explore his theory of the forms, which has been a cornerstone of metaphysical thought for centuries, and we'll dive into the darker side of his thinking, such as his noble lie and his inconsistent views on women. And here's the twist: while we explore these ideas, we won't just take them at face value. We'll challenge them, critique them, and look at how they hold up in today's world. We're not just going to repeat the old philosophical arguments or recite Plato's greatest hits. No, we're going to dig deeper. We'll ask the tough questions. Did Plato's utopia really stand for justice? Or was it an early prototype for authoritarianism? Was his concept of the philosopher-king a noble vision of enlightened leadership, or a dangerous concentration of power in the hands of a few? And what about his views on women, which seemed so progressive in some places, but downright regressive in others? By the end of this video, you'll not only understand why Plato's ideas continue to shape modern philosophy and politics, but also why his ideas are far from flawless. You'll walk away with a more nuanced understanding of Plato's legacy, one that appreciates his immense contributions while also recognizing the limitations and blind spots in his thinking. It's a complicated, messy, and incredibly important philosophical legacy, and one that's still worth exploring, critiquing, and learning from today. So, buckle up. You're about to dive into the world of Plato's thought, a world where the search for truth, justice, and the perfect society meet the harsh realities of human imperfection. It's a journey that will challenge your thinking, force you to question assumptions, and maybe even inspire you to take a deeper look at how we understand the world we live in. Whether you're a philosophy student, a casual thinker, or just curious about how ancient ideas still impact us today, you're in for a fascinating ride. Let's get started. Plato's philosophy has had an enduring influence on Western thought, and one of the central components of his intellectual legacy is the theory of forms, or ideas. At the heart of this theory lies the belief that the world we experience through our senses, the trees, animals, buildings, and even abstract concepts like justice and love, is not the true reality, but only an imperfect imitation of a perfect and unchanging world that exists beyond our sensory perception. Plato argued that this world of sensory experience is merely a shadow of the real world, which is composed of eternal, unchanging, and perfect forms. For Plato, these forms represent the ultimate reality, while everything we encounter in the physical world is just a poor reflection of those perfect forms. Imagine for a moment that everything you see and touch, the chair you're sitting on, the cup you're drinking from, the smile of your best friend, isn't the actual thing in its purest form. Instead, it's just a pale approximation, an imperfect version of the true form of that thing that exists in a higher realm. For example, every tree you've ever seen is an imperfect copy of the ideal tree, a perfect, eternal form that transcends time and space. This ideal tree doesn't change, doesn't age, and doesn't wither. It is the perfect essence of what tree is. Similarly, the concept of justice, or even love, is not a single instance of an event or a feeling, but a perfect, immutable form that embodies the highest possible version of justice or love. What Plato is suggesting here is a radical shift in how we view the world around us. He invites us to look beyond appearances and consider that what we see with our senses is merely an illusion or a shadow of the real world that we cannot directly access. The realm of forms is outside of our normal experience, accessible only through reason and intellectual contemplation. This is why, according to Plato, philosophy becomes so important. Philosophy is the practice of the soul, the way we can access higher truths and come closer to understanding the forms. Philosophers, Plato believed, are uniquely positioned to glimpse these forms through their rational minds, as they are trained to look beyond the surface of things and contemplate the deeper truths of existence. In his most famous work, The Republic, Plato lays out his ideas about how this theory of forms relates to the construction of a just society. If we understand the ideal forms, we can come closer to living the ideal life. Plato argued, a just society is one that is governed by the principles embodied in the forms, particularly the form of justice. The philosopher-king, the ideal ruler of Plato's envisioned utopia, is someone who has transcended the limitations of the sensory world and has access to the deeper truths found in the realm of forms. The philosopher-king is uniquely qualified to rule, not because of his birthright or wealth, but because he understands the true nature of justice, goodness, and virtue in a way that others cannot. The implications of Plato's theory of forms are far-reaching, influencing metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, and even political theory. For centuries, thinkers have wrestled with his idea of a transcendent realm of perfect forms, pondering whether such a realm really exists and how we might gain knowledge of it. Plato's theory of forms also laid the groundwork for later debates about the nature of universals, those concepts like redness, beauty, and justice, and whether they exist independently of particular instances in the world, or whether they are just human-made abstractions. Despite its far-reaching influence, Plato's theory of forms has not gone without criticism, both in his own time and in later philosophical traditions. One of the most prominent early critics of the theory was Plato's own student, Aristotle. While Plato viewed the forms as existing independently of the physical world, Aristotle rejected this idea and argued that the forms of things exist not separately in some higher realm, but rather within the things themselves. In other words, for Aristotle, the tree is not just an imperfect copy of an ideal tree. The essence or form of the tree exists within the tree itself, in its material substance and its particular qualities. Aristotle believed that by studying individual objects in the world, we could understand their underlying forms and grasp the nature of reality. Aristotle's critique of Plato's theory of forms highlights a fundamental divide in their philosophical approaches. Plato's theory is a form of idealism, emphasizing a world of abstract, perfect forms beyond the physical world. Aristotle's approach, by contrast, is more grounded in empirical observation and materialism. For Aristotle, the world we experience through our senses is not just a distorted reflection of an abstract world of forms, but is itself the true object of knowledge and inquiry. Aristotle's critique of Plato's metaphysics helped set the stage for later developments in science and natural philosophy, where the focus would shift from a quest for abstract, ideal forms to a more empirical and observational approach to understanding the world. Even beyond Aristotle, Plato's theory of forms has been a topic of ongoing debate in philosophy. Some have rejected the theory altogether, while others have attempted to modify or adapt it to fit with more contemporary views. One of the main criticisms of Plato's theory is that it raises the question of how these perfect forms can be known to us if they exist outside the realm of sensory experience. How can we have any knowledge of a world we can never directly access? Plato's response to this is that knowledge of the forms is innate or comes through intellectual insight, rather than through sensory perception. This leads to the question of how, or even if, such knowledge can be attained, given the limitations of human cognition and experience. Despite these criticisms, the theory of forms remains one of Plato's most enduring and influential contributions to philosophy. His view that the physical world is not the ultimate reality, but only a reflection of a deeper, unchanging truth, has influenced countless thinkers across the centuries, from medieval theologians like Augustine and Thomas Aquinas to modern philosophers like Immanuel Kant and even contemporary metaphysicians. The idea of the forms continues to resonate with those who seek to understand the nature of reality and the limits of human knowledge. One of the most important implications of Plato's theory of forms is its emphasis on the power of reason. Plato's thought highlights the idea that our senses can deceive us, and that true knowledge comes not through observation of the physical world, but through the use of reason and intellect. This idea would go on to shape the development of rationalism in modern philosophy, particularly in the works of René Descartes, who famously declared that, "I think, therefore I am." For Descartes and other rationalists, reason was the path to knowledge, and the physical world was often seen as unreliable and deceptive. In this sense, Plato's theory of forms can be seen as an early form of rationalist thinking, setting the stage for later developments in the philosophy of mind and epistemology. But Plato's idea of the forms also raises important ethical and political questions. If the perfect forms of justice, beauty, and goodness exist beyond the physical world, does that mean that human beings can never fully embody these ideals in their lives? Are we forever limited by the imperfections of our physical existence? Or can we, through philosophical contemplation, come closer to realizing the ideal in our own lives and in society? Plato's vision of the philosopher-king offers one answer to this question, suggesting that those who have knowledge of the forms can lead society toward a more just and harmonious state. But this raises another question. If only a select few have access to the forms, does that mean that only a select few are qualified to rule? And how can we ensure that those who claim to have access to the forms are truly virtuous and not simply using their position for power? These questions point to the complexity and depth of Plato's thought, as well as the challenges of applying his philosophical ideas to real-world problems. While Plato's theory of forms offers a vision of a higher, more perfect reality beyond our sensory experience, it also raises profound questions about the nature of knowledge, power, and justice. These are questions that have continued to occupy philosophers for centuries, and Plato's theory remains a foundational point of departure for anyone seeking to understand the relationship between the physical world and the world of abstract ideas. Even today, Plato's philosophy challenges us to think more deeply about the nature of reality, the limits of human knowledge, and the possibilities for creating a more just and harmonious society. Plato's political philosophy, particularly as outlined in the Republic, offers a fascinating vision of society, governance, and justice that still provokes discussion today. In this work, Plato presents his idea of an ideal state, one that is guided by wisdom, rationality, and the pursuit of truth, Central to this vision is the concept of the philosopher-king, a ruler who is not motivated by wealth, power, or personal ambition, but by an unwavering commitment to justice and the good of society as a whole. For Plato, ruling was a craft, similar to any other skilled trade, something that required training, expertise, and, most importantly, a deep understanding of the ultimate truths that govern the universe, which, for Plato, were embodied in the forms. The philosopher-king, then, is someone who has not only mastered the art of ruling, but has also undergone rigorous philosophical education. This education would be designed to help the ruler access the higher realm of the forms, particularly the form of the good, which Plato considered to be the highest and most important of all the forms. A philosopher-king would be someone who could see beyond the physical world and understand the eternal, unchanging truths that lie at the heart of reality. Because of this understanding, the philosopher-king would be uniquely qualified to lead the state in a way that ensures harmony and justice. Plato's reasoning for this is quite straightforward. If a ruler is truly to govern wisely and justly, they must understand the ultimate nature of things, particularly the nature of justice itself. This means that, for Plato, the ruler must not be driven by personal desires or fleeting emotions, but must instead be guided by reason and intellectual insight. In his ideal state, Plato imagines a harmonious society where each class has a specific function, and each class contributes to the greater good in a way that is appropriate for their talents and abilities. The rulers, as philosopher-kings, would have the wisdom to make decisions that are best for everyone, guided by their knowledge of the forms. In Plato's vision of the ideal society, there are three main classes: the producers, the warriors, and the rulers. The producers are the workers, farmers, artisans, and merchants who provide for the material needs of society. The warriors are the soldiers and defenders who protect the state from external threats. Finally, the rulers, or philosopher-kings, are those who govern and make the crucial decisions for the society based on their wisdom and understanding of the forms. These classes are not determined by birth or wealth, but by the natural aptitudes of individuals. Plato believed that each person has a specific nature, and it is the job of society to identify that nature and assign individuals to the class that best fits their talents and abilities. In this structure, the philosopher-king is at the top, the most important class, because they have the wisdom to understand what is best for the state and the people. The warriors and the producers, while essential, do not possess the same level of understanding. The warriors are needed to defend the state and maintain order, but their role is one of action, not intellectual decision-making. The producers, in turn, are necessary to ensure the material well-being of the society, but they do not have the capacity or training to understand the deeper philosophical principles that should guide the state. The philosopher-king, then, is the key to the functioning of Plato's ideal society, as they are the ones who can bring about justice by understanding what justice truly is. What makes Plato's political ideas particularly striking is the way in which he integrates his metaphysical views with his political theory. For Plato, political philosophy is inseparable from his ideas about the nature of reality. Just as the philosopher seeks to understand the true nature of reality through reason and intellectual contemplation, so too must the ruler understand the true nature of society and justice in order to govern effectively. This idea makes Plato's political philosophy highly idealistic, as it assumes that there is a higher, unchanging truth to guide society, and that the rulers of that society can access this truth through their philosophical training. While this is a compelling vision, it also raises significant questions about the feasibility of such a system in practice. One of the most interesting and progressive aspects of Plato's political philosophy, especially by the standards of his time, is his treatment of women. In the ideal society that Plato envisions, women are afforded the same rights and opportunities as men, particularly in terms of their roles as rulers and philosophers. Plato argues that there is no reason why women should be excluded from the intellectual and political life of the state. Just as men can study philosophy and become philosopher-kings, so too can women. For Plato, the intellectual abilities of men and women are equal, and therefore, there is no justification for excluding women from positions of leadership. This progressive view stands in stark contrast to the prevailing attitudes in ancient Greek society, where women were often seen as inferior to men, both intellectually and physically. In fact, many Greek thinkers, including Plato's contemporaries, held deeply patriarchal views about women's roles in society. Women were often confined to the home and excluded from public life, particularly from positions of power and influence. Plato's willingness to include women as potential rulers and philosophers was a radical departure from these norms, and it shows that, in some respects, he was ahead of his time. However, it's important to note that Plato's treatment of women was not entirely consistent. While he argued that women could be equal to men in terms of intellectual ability and political power, he also subscribed to certain stereotypes about women that were common in ancient Greek thought. For example, in other works, Plato suggests that women are more prone to irrationality and emotional instability than men. He also accepts the idea that women's bodies are more prone to physical weakness and illness, a view that was widespread in Greek medicine at the time. So, while Plato's advocacy for women's intellectual equality was groundbreaking, it was tempered by certain views about women's nature that would be considered problematic today. Another significant and controversial aspect of Plato's political theory is his concept of the noble lie. In the Republic, Plato argues that in order to maintain social harmony and ensure that each class in society remains in its proper place, the rulers should propagate a noble lie, a falsehood that helps maintain order and stability. Specifically, Plato suggests that the rulers should tell the citizens that their souls are made of different materials, gold, silver, or bronze, and that their position in society is determined by the material of their soul. The idea is that people would then accept their roles in life, whether as producers, warriors, or rulers, based on this belief that their roles are divinely ordained. While the noble lie is meant to promote social cohesion, it raises ethical concerns, especially in terms of how much control rulers should have over the beliefs and perceptions of the people. Plato justifies this deception by claiming that it is for the greater good, as it ensures the stability and harmony of the state. However, this idea has been criticized for its potential to be abused by those in power. The noble lie, in many ways, can be seen as a precursor to later forms of political propaganda, where the state controls information and shapes public perception in order to maintain authority. The notion of the philosopher-king, while alluring in its idealism, also raises questions about the practical realities of governance. Who decides who is fit to be a philosopher-king? What happens when the rulers are not as wise or virtuous as Plato envisions? And can the ideal of the philosopher-king ever truly be realized? Given the complexities of human nature and society, these are some of the challenges that Plato's political theory presents, and they highlight the tension between idealism and reality in his vision of the just society. Nonetheless, Plato's political thought remains one of the most important and influential contributions to the field of political philosophy. His idea of the philosopher-king continues to inspire discussions about leadership, wisdom, and the role of intellectuals in politics. While some aspects of his theory may seem impractical or outdated, his focus on the importance of reason, justice, and the pursuit of truth in governance remains a powerful and relevant idea for contemporary political thought. Despite its flaws and limitations, Plato's political philosophy challenges us to think deeply about the nature of power, the role of the philosopher in society, and the pursuit of justice in a complex and imperfect world. Plato's vision of an ideal society, as laid out in the Republic, is grounded in a sophisticated and elaborate theory of justice, governance, and the roles of different classes in society. However, alongside his groundbreaking ideas about philosopher-kings and the structure of a just city-state, Plato introduced a concept that has remained one of the most controversial and ethically troubling aspects of his political theory, the noble lie. This idea presents a fundamental contradiction within Plato's philosophy, as it calls for the deliberate manipulation of truth for the sake of maintaining social order. Despite his commitment to reason, justice, and the pursuit of higher truths, Plato suggests that rulers should be allowed to deceive the citizens in order to preserve societal harmony. The noble lie, as Plato proposes it, serves as a kind of social glue designed to prevent unrest and ensure that each class in society accepts their role. According to Plato's structure of the ideal city, there are three main classes: the producers, the warriors, and the rulers. Each class has a specific function. Producers provide the material needs of society. Warriors defend it, and rulers govern it. In order for this system to work smoothly, Plato argues, each class must be convinced that their position is not a matter of choice or circumstance, but is instead a result of their innate qualities that are determined by the composition of their soul. The rulers, being the wisest and most rational, are said to possess souls made of gold. The warriors have silver in their souls, and the producers have souls made of bronze or iron, to maintain stability and prevent dissatisfaction among the lower classes. Plato suggests that the rulers should teach their citizens a noble lie, that their roles in society are predestined based on the material of their souls. This lie, according to Plato, is necessary because it helps individuals accept their social roles without resentment. If the people believe that they are inherently suited for their place in society, they are less likely to challenge the system, creating a harmonious and stable social order. The noble lie, then, functions as a form of ideological control, encouraging people to embrace their station in life as both natural and unchangeable. While Plato presents this idea as a necessary evil for the greater good of society, it raises profound ethical questions. The first issue is the very notion of manipulating truth. Plato's entire philosophy is based on the belief that the philosopher, through reason, can uncover higher truths about the world. In the realm of politics, however, he seems to suggest that those in power are justified in distorting or hiding the truth for the sake of maintaining social harmony. This stands in stark contrast to the idea of an enlightened ruler who governs based on rational understanding and virtue. Instead, Plato's noble lie suggests that the philosopher-king, who is supposed to be the wisest and most virtuous individual, would not hesitate to deceive the citizens in order to ensure that society functions according to his vision of justice. The ethical dilemma here is clear. Can deception ever be justified in the name of social stability? Plato seems to argue that it can, as long as it serves the greater good and maintains order in society. However, this opens up the potential for abuse. In the wrong hands, the noble lie could easily become a tool for those in power to manipulate and control the masses. Plato's justification for the noble lie is that it preserves social harmony and keeps people content with their roles. But this reasoning is inherently authoritarian. It assumes that the rulers, who are meant to be the wisest and most virtuous members of society, are the only ones capable of knowing what is best for everyone. This creates an unequal power dynamic, where the rulers are allowed to decide what is best for the citizens, even if it means deceiving them. In this sense, the noble lie has the potential to legitimize an authoritarian regime where truth is subordinated to the needs of the state. Plato's noble lie can also be seen as a precursor to modern propaganda. The idea that the state can manipulate the truth for the sake of societal stability has been used throughout history to justify the control of information and the shaping of public perception. Authoritarian regimes, particularly in the 20th century, have often employed propaganda to promote certain ideologies and maintain power. In this light, Plato's noble lie can be seen as an early form of political manipulation, one that seeks to control the beliefs and perceptions of the people in order to ensure their compliance with the established order. It is important to recognize that Plato himself was not advocating for arbitrary deception, but rather for a carefully constructed myth that he believed would ensure the well-being of the state. He viewed the noble lie as a way of preventing social strife and ensuring that people would work together for the common good. However, this raises another important issue: the tension between the idealism of Plato's political theory and the pragmatic realities of human nature. Plato believed that a just society could only be achieved if everyone accepted their place and worked toward the greater good. But what happens when individuals refuse to accept their assigned roles? What happens when the noble lie is exposed? Or when people become aware of the deception? Would the system still hold up under scrutiny? Or would it collapse? In this context, the noble lie also brings to light Plato's somewhat idealistic, if not naive, view of human nature. His model of society assumes that the rulers will always be wise and virtuous, and that they will use their power for the benefit of the people. However, history has shown that those in power are often motivated by personal gain and are not always as virtuous as Plato would have hoped. Plato's failure to fully account for the potential corruption of power within his political system is one of the key weaknesses of his political philosophy. Additionally, the noble lie raises questions about the relationship between truth and justice. If the truth is subordinated to the needs of the state, what becomes of justice? Plato's ideal society is one where justice is the highest good, and the philosopher-king is the one who understands and embodies justice. But when the truth is manipulated for the sake of political stability, it becomes difficult to separate what is truly just from what is merely convenient for the rulers. In this sense, the noble lie compromises the very idea of justice that Plato holds dear. Justice, in Plato's system, is supposed to be based on the objective understanding of the forms, and the philosopher-king is the one who can recognize and uphold these truths. However, when the rulers are allowed to deceive the people for their own good, the line between truth and justice becomes blurred. Moreover, Plato's noble lie also points to a deeper issue within his conception of governance, the tension between idealism and realism. Plato's ideal state, led by philosopher-kings, assumes that the rulers are not only wise and virtuous, but also incorruptible. Yet, this assumption rests on a fragile foundation. What happens when philosopher-kings are not as wise as Plato envisions, or when their wisdom is compromised by political pressures? Plato's idea that the rulers should tell the citizens what is best for them, even if it involves deception, overlooks the possibility that rulers might use such power for personal or political gain. This critique is especially relevant in light of the numerous historical examples where rulers have justified deception, manipulation, and propaganda to maintain power, often to the detriment of their societies. The concept of the noble lie has left an indelible mark on political thought, not just in ancient Greece but throughout the history of political theory. Many political theorists have grappled with the ethical implications of Plato's noble lie and its potential to justify the manipulation of truth by those in power. Some critics have argued that Plato's noble lie is a reflection of his elitism and his belief that only a select few are capable of understanding the truth. Others have pointed out that Plato's ideal society, with its rigid class structure and emphasis on the importance of the philosopher-king, is deeply undemocratic and authoritarian. By introducing the idea of the noble lie, Plato is effectively conceding that the rulers must control the truth in order to preserve the social order, which is a deeply troubling concept for modern democratic values. Despite its ethical concerns, Plato's noble lie remains one of the most provocative and enduring ideas in political philosophy. It serves as a reminder of the complexities and dangers of political power, and the lengths to which rulers may go to maintain their control. The noble lie challenges us to think critically about the role of truth in politics, the relationship between the rulers and the ruled, and the ethical limits of state power. While Plato's noble lie was conceived as a way to promote social harmony and justice, it also raises fundamental questions about the nature of truth, power, and justice in political life. Plato's views on women present a paradox that challenges his reputation as a progressive philosopher. On the one hand, he advocated for women's equal opportunities in his ideal society, particularly in the realm of politics and philosophy. On the other hand, his other works betray a much more traditional and even patriarchal view of women. His treatment of women, therefore, reflects an inconsistency that complicates his legacy. In the Republic, Plato famously argued that women, like men, should be given the opportunity to pursue intellectual education, participate in governance, and hold positions of power, including serving as philosopher-kings. For Plato, the idea that women were naturally inferior to men was an outdated and erroneous notion. He suggested that there was no reason why women, given the same training and intellectual opportunities, couldn't perform the same roles in society as men, particularly in leadership. This progressive view was radical for its time and remains one of the more forward-thinking aspects of his political philosophy. In many ways, He was advocating for a sort of intellectual gender equality long before it became a common idea in the Western world. However, Plato's egalitarian stance in the Republic is far from universally consistent across his works. While he grants women intellectual equality in his utopian society, in other writings, he adheres to more traditional and deeply problematic views about women's nature. For example, in Timaeus, Plato famously expressed the idea that women were biologically and physiologically inferior to men. He believed that women's bodies were naturally weaker, their dispositions more erratic, and their intellectual capacities less developed. In this regard, Plato's thinking mirrors the dominant views of ancient Greek society, which saw women primarily as caregivers and nurturers, roles that excluded them from public life and intellectual pursuits. In Plato's Timaeus, he also introduces a bizarre and troubling theory regarding women's wombs. According to Plato, the womb was not just a biological organ but a wandering animal within the body that could cause illness in women. He described this wandering womb as a disruptive force that could make women emotionally unstable, mentally erratic, and even physically sick. This idea was common in ancient Greek medicine, where women were often seen as being more prone to hysteria and emotional instability due to their reproductive organs. For Plato, this theory was not just a medical explanation, but a reflection of women's supposed inherent instability, which in turn justified their exclusion from certain societal roles. This theory of the wandering womb is perhaps one of the most unfortunate aspects of Plato's views on women. It reflects an attitude toward female biology that was both scientifically inaccurate and deeply misogynistic. Plato's suggestion that women's emotional and intellectual shortcomings were a result of their reproductive organs further reinforced the idea that women were inherently inferior to men, particularly in the realm of reason and intellect. In Plato's mind, women were not fully capable of rational thought and leadership, a position that seems to conflict with his more progressive ideas about their potential in the Republic. This contradiction between his progressive political ideas and his regressive views on women's biology makes Plato's philosophy difficult to reconcile on the issue of gender equality. It's important to note that Plato's views on women were not unique in the context of ancient Greek thought. His contemporaries, such as Aristotle, shared similar opinions on women's inferiority. Aristotle, for example, argued that women were biologically and mentally inferior to men, and that their primary role was to bear children and manage the household. This view was widespread in ancient Greece, and it heavily influenced Western thought for centuries to come. However, Plato's willingness to grant women equal educational and political rights in the Republic suggests that he was, in some respects, more progressive than his contemporaries. At the same time, his acceptance of deeply ingrained stereotypes about women's biological inferiority and irrationality shows how difficult it was for even the most forward-thinking philosophers of the time to break free from prevailing cultural prejudices. The inconsistencies in Plato's views on women have had lasting consequences, influencing Western thought for centuries. His ideas about women as biologically inferior and prone to irrationality were adopted by many in the medical and philosophical fields throughout the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. These ideas were not only accepted as fact, but were used to justify the exclusion of women from education, politics, and other aspects of public life. The belief in women's inherent emotional instability, in particular, was used to legitimize their confinement to domestic roles, further reinforcing the gender hierarchies of the time. The notion that women were biologically inferior also had a profound impact on medical practices. Plato's theory of the wandering womb, for example, became a widely accepted explanation for women's supposed emotional and mental instability. In the centuries following Plato, physicians and scholars continued to uphold the idea that women were more susceptible to hysteria and other psychological disorders because of their reproductive organs. This view persisted well into the 19th century and was used to justify the treatment of women as fragile, irrational, and in need of male guidance and control. The lingering influence of these ideas can still be seen in some areas of medical and psychological practice, even in modern times. Despite these deeply problematic aspects of his thinking, it is also worth noting that Plato's treatment of women was, in some ways, a product of his time. Ancient Greek society was fiercely patriarchal, and most philosophical and political thinkers of the time did not question the exclusion of women from public life. Plato's willingness to argue for women's inclusion in education and political leadership, even within the framework of his ideal city, was a radical departure from the norm. He recognized that women, just like men, could benefit from education and intellectual development, and he believed that they should have the opportunity to pursue these opportunities. This was a revolutionary idea in the ancient world and laid the groundwork for future arguments for gender equality. However, Plato's failure to fully reconcile his views on women with his broader philosophy is a reminder that even the most brilliant and innovative thinkers are not immune to the biases of their time. While his ideas about the ideal society were groundbreaking in many respects, they also reflect the deeply ingrained prejudices of ancient Greek culture, particularly regarding gender. Plato's treatment of women illustrates the limitations of even the most forward-thinking philosophical systems when they are shaped by the cultural and societal norms of their time. Despite his intellectual achievements, Plato was not able to escape the patriarchal attitudes that were so deeply embedded in the social fabric of ancient Greece. In considering Plato's views on women, we are reminded of the complex and often contradictory nature of his philosophy. On the one hand, he offered a vision of a society in which women and men could be equally educated and serve as leaders. On the other hand, he clung to outdated and harmful notions about women's biological inferiority and irrationality. This tension between his radical ideas and his acceptance of traditional gender roles shows that even the greatest philosophers are shaped by the cultural context in which they live. While Plato's contributions to political theory, metaphysics, and ethics continue to be studied and admired, his views on women serve as a cautionary tale about the difficulty of transcending the biases of one's time. Ultimately, Plato's legacy on the question of gender equality is mixed. While his ideas in the Republic laid the intellectual groundwork for future discussions of women's rights and equality, his views on women's biology and emotional instability reflect the broader cultural prejudices that would continue to shape Western thought for centuries. Plato's inconsistent treatment of women is a reminder that even the most progressive ideas can be undermined by the deep-seated biases of the time in which they are conceived. His philosophy, as advanced and groundbreaking as it was, could not fully escape the limits of the cultural and intellectual climate in which it was formed. Plato's views on women present a fascinating, yet highly problematic, aspect of his philosophy. In many ways, he was ahead of his time, advocating for women's equal participation in his ideal society. In the Republic, he suggested that women should have the same educational opportunities and be eligible for leadership roles in society, including as rulers or philosopher-kings. Plato believed that men and women were both capable of reasoning and learning, and that there was no reason why women should be excluded from the intellectual and political spheres, especially if they were capable of the same virtues and wisdom that men could achieve. In a world where women were often relegated to domestic duties and excluded from public life, Plato's argument for their equality was groundbreaking, even radical. However, despite these progressive ideas in the Republic, Plato's overall views on women were inconsistent and often steeped in the cultural prejudices of his time. His views on gender were far from uniform across his body of work, and he simultaneously acknowledged women's potential for intellectual and political involvement, while also subscribing to harmful, deeply ingrained stereotypes about women's nature and abilities. This inconsistency is perhaps one of the most troubling aspects of his legacy when it comes to gender equality. In Timaeus, Plato's views take a sharp turn as he embraces some of the most regressive and misogynistic ideas of his time. There, he describes women as biologically weaker and less rational than men, reinforcing the traditional Greek belief that women were not naturally suited to intellectual or political life. He argued that women's bodies were flawed by nature, and that their physical and mental capacities were inferior to those of men. Plato even perpetuated the belief that women's wombs were wandering animals, capable of moving around their bodies and causing a range of physical and emotional disturbances. This notion, known as hysteria, was widely accepted in ancient Greece and continued to influence medical and philosophical thought for centuries. The idea of the wandering womb was central to the understanding of female biology in ancient Greece. According to this theory, women's wombs would sometimes detach from their proper position within the body and roam around, causing various forms of illness and emotional instability. Plato, like many of his contemporaries, believed that this wandering womb was the root cause of women's supposed mental and emotional instability. He theorized that women were more prone to irrational behavior, not because of any intellectual deficiency, but because their wombs disrupted the balance of their humors, causing them to become hysterical, emotional, or even physically ill. This view of women was not just a medical theory, but also a deeply ingrained cultural belief. Women were often seen as more emotionally unstable and less capable of rational thought than men, and Plato's acceptance of these stereotypes reinforced this perception. His acceptance of these views is all the more surprising given that his own theory of the soul and his ideas about education and reason should have led him to question these assumptions. For Plato, reason and rationality were the hallmarks of the philosopher and the ruler. Yet, in his writings about women, he seems to accept the idea that women were naturally irrational and incapable of true philosophical contemplation or leadership. His acceptance of these views is a troubling reminder of the way in which even the most advanced thinkers of the time were often influenced by prevailing social and cultural prejudices. The contrast between Plato's progressive stance on women in the Republic and his regressive views in Timaeus is stark. On the one hand, he argues for the intellectual and political equality of women, advocating for their right to education, participation in public life, and leadership roles in society. On the other hand, he describes women as biologically and emotionally inferior to men, suggesting that their minds are weaker and more prone to instability. This inconsistency is not easily reconcilable, and it presents a significant challenge to our understanding of Plato's views on gender. It's as though Plato was able to break free from the restrictive ideas of his time in certain areas, but remained shackled by them in others. This contradiction in Plato's views is perhaps best understood in the context of his broader philosophical system. Plato's theory of the soul is based on the idea that human beings are composed of three parts: reason, spirit, and appetite. According to this theory, reason is the highest and most important aspect of the soul, and it is through the cultivation of reason that one can achieve true knowledge and wisdom. In the Republic, Plato's philosopher-kings are those who have the most developed reason, and it is through their reason that they are able to govern justly and wisely. However, when it comes to women, Plato seems to suggest that their reason is somehow impaired by their biology. In this sense, Plato's view of women is paradoxical. While he acknowledges their capacity for reason and education, he also seems to believe that they are inherently less rational than men due to their physiology. This tension in Plato's views about women has had lasting implications, both in philosophy and in society. His idea that women were inherently weaker and less rational was widely accepted in the centuries that followed, particularly in the fields of medicine and philosophy. In the Middle Ages and beyond, the concept of the wandering womb was used to explain a range of female ailments, from hysteria to infertility. This theory was not just a medical explanation, but also a cultural justification for the exclusion of women from intellectual and political life. By portraying women as biologically inferior and emotionally unstable, Plato's ideas helped to reinforce the notion that women were better suited to domestic duties and were unfit for the public sphere. The lingering influence of Plato's regressive views on women can be seen throughout European history, from the medieval period to the early modern era. In the centuries following Plato, the idea of the wandering womb continued to shape medical practice, and women were often diagnosed with various mental illnesses based on their reproductive organs. Women who exhibited emotional or intellectual instability were often diagnosed with hysteria or other disorders related to their reproductive system. This view persisted well into the 19th century, when women were still frequently treated as mentally unstable or hysterical because of their gender. The idea that women's emotional and intellectual capacities were tied to their biology helped to justify the widespread exclusion of women from education, politics, and the professions. At the same time, however, Plato's more progressive views on women in the Republic continued to inspire those who sought to challenge these long-standing prejudices. His argument for women's equality in education and leadership helped to lay the groundwork for later feminist thinkers and political movements. Plato's belief that women should have the same opportunities as men, particularly in the intellectual and political realms, was a radical departure from the views of many of his contemporaries, and it foreshadowed the broader push for gender equality that would emerge centuries later. The contradiction in his views, however, reminds us that progress in one area does not always translate into progress in others. Even the most forward-thinking philosophers are often products of their time, and their ideas about gender are shaped by the cultural biases and beliefs of their societies. In the end, Plato's views on women offer a complex and contradictory picture. While he was groundbreaking in his advocacy for women's intellectual and political equality, his acceptance of harmful, regressive ideas about women's biology and emotional instability reflects the deep cultural prejudices of his time. Plato's inability to fully reconcile these two views highlights the challenges that even the most progressive thinkers face when trying to break free from the constraints of their cultural context. The legacy of Plato's views on women is a reminder of the difficulty of transcending the biases of one's time, and it serves as a cautionary tale about the persistence of gender inequality. Even in the most forward-thinking philosophical systems, Plato's attempt to classify humans as featherless bipeds is one of the more entertaining and humbling episodes in the history of philosophy. This definition, which Plato offered in his effort to create a clear and logical classification of species, ultimately turned out to be not only incorrect but also easily refuted by a practical demonstration. The story of Diogenes the Cynic's playful critique of Plato's definition offers a reminder that even the greatest minds can make embarrassing errors. At the core of Plato's philosophical project was the desire for clarity and precision. In trying to create a comprehensive and systematic understanding of the world, he believed that human beings should be categorized like any other animal through the use of clear, universal definitions. In his dialogues, Plato frequently used logical distinctions to define the essence of things. By boiling down the attributes of something to its most essential characteristics, Plato thought he could arrive at deeper truths about the nature of reality. This is what led him to his famous definition of humans as featherless bipeds. It was a definition that attempted to establish the distinctive characteristics of humanity: two legs, no feathers as an intellectual shortcut to differentiate humans from other animals. However, Plato's neatly packaged definition was far from flawless. As the story goes, Diogenes, one of the more eccentric and irreverent philosophers of his time, entered Plato's academy carrying a plucked chicken. He triumphantly held it up to the group and declared, "Here is Plato's man." This simple act of holding up the chicken now stripped of its feathers undermined Plato's definition with a punch of absurdity, highlighting how overly simplistic and incomplete the philosopher's characterization of humans was. Diogenes, known for his mockery of conventional thinking and his disdain for pompous intellectualism, used this moment to point out that a definition based on such superficial traits could never truly capture the essence of humanity. The image of Diogenes holding up a chicken as a critique of Plato's intellectual system has since become a famous anecdote, illustrating the sometimes comical consequences of overcomplicating something as complex as human nature. This incident underscores a deeper, more philosophical question. How reliable are our intellectual frameworks in capturing the complexities of the world? Plato, for all his intellectual rigor and philosophical brilliance, had succumbed to the temptation of simplifying human existence into a neat, reductionist definition. Diogenes' intervention serves as a reminder of how difficult it is to reduce the richness of life to a handful of qualities or principles. While Plato was trying to fit humans into a logical system, Diogenes demonstrated that definitions, however seemingly objective, can fall apart when subjected to the messiness of reality. His plucked chicken is a symbolic representation of how intellectual pursuits, no matter how sophisticated, can be hilariously derailed when confronted with the unexpected. The featherless biped incident can be seen as a humbling lesson about the limits of human reason and categorization. In philosophy, and in life more generally, definitions and systems of thought are often essential tools for understanding the world. However, they are only valuable as long as we remain aware of their limitations. In Plato's case, his effort to define humanity by one physical characteristic ignored the deeper complexity of human nature, including our emotional, intellectual, and moral dimensions. By focusing on a single trait, bipedalism, Plato overlooked other more defining aspects of what it means to be human. Diogenes, by presenting the plucked chicken, reminded Plato and his followers that intellectual systems and definitions should always be scrutinized, as they risk oversimplifying or distorting the reality they attempt to describe. Philosophical definitions, like all human systems of thought, are subject to revision. In fact, many of the most powerful ideas in philosophy arise from the recognition that a simple definition or categorization needs to be expanded or reconsidered. For example, Plato's own theory of forms, one of his most influential and enduring ideas, was not easily reduced to simple definitions or concepts. The forms, in Plato's view, were eternal, perfect, and immutable ideals that existed beyond the physical world. They could not be captured through the senses or understood in the same way as physical objects. This complexity stands in stark contrast to the simplicity of the featherless biped definition. Plato's later work, his deeper inquiries into metaphysics and epistemology, illustrated his recognition that not all truths could be grasped through simplistic, surface-level definitions. While the featherless biped moment was a minor, almost comical misstep in Plato's career, it serves as an early indication that intellectual systems can fail when they attempt to simplify things that are inherently more complex. This incident also raises another important question. To what extent is human reason capable of capturing the full scope of reality? Plato's mistake in defining humans through a physical trait that can be easily disproved suggests a limit to what our senses and intellectual systems can tell us about the world. The mind may try to reduce the world to logical categories, but reality itself is often far messier and more unpredictable than any intellectual system can account for. Plato's idealism and his belief in the forms, for instance, were his attempts to escape the seeming chaos of the sensory world and elevate the mind to higher, more permanent truths. But the featherless biped incident highlights the inherent challenges in this quest for clarity. Sometimes the complexity of the world simply defies our best efforts to categorize it. The idea that humans could be defined merely by their physical attributes seemed reasonable in theory, but when put into practice, it proved inadequate and overly simplistic. This story also brings attention to the playful side of philosophy. Philosophers like Diogenes, with their direct and often irreverent challenges to the prevailing intellectual norms, remind us that philosophical inquiry does not always need to be a solemn or rigid exercise. Diogenes was not afraid to challenge the great thinkers of his time, and his witty critique of Plato's definition serves as a reminder that questioning established ideas can sometimes be done in a humorous and irreverent way. His action was not just a clever joke. It was also a deep philosophical challenge to Plato's assumption that a simple definition could capture the full complexity of human nature. It is a perfect example of how philosophy can be not just about abstract reasoning and logical deduction, but also about challenging assumptions and using creativity to look at things from a different angle. The featherless biped incident also serves as a reminder of how intellectual systems, even those that seem authoritative or universally accepted, are not immune to critique. Even Plato, regarded as one of the foundational figures of Western philosophy, was not above making errors or offering definitions that could be easily ridiculed. This humbling aspect of Plato's philosophy is important to acknowledge, as it encourages humility in our own intellectual pursuits. No matter how rigorously we may approach a problem or idea, we must remain open to the possibility that our reasoning could be flawed or incomplete. The Diogenes episode demonstrates how powerful and insightful critiques can come from unexpected sources, and that sometimes a simple challenge can expose the limitations of even the most well-established ideas. In the grander scheme, This incident is part of the broader conversation in philosophy about the reliability of reason, the limitations of definitions, and the potential dangers of intellectual hubris. It emphasizes that intellectual clarity and precision, while valuable, should always be tempered by an awareness of the complexity of the world. It also encourages a certain humility in our intellectual endeavors. Philosophers like Diogenes remind us that, at times, it is necessary to disrupt accepted definitions and challenge established systems of thought, not just for the sake of critique, but to deepen our understanding of the world and ourselves. The featherless biped incident, therefore, is not only a lesson about the fallibility of human reason, but also an invitation to remain curious, critical, and open to the nuances and messiness of the world we live in. Plato's legacy, despite his many flaws, has had an undeniable influence on the development of Western philosophy, politics, and culture. His work provided a foundation for centuries of philosophical inquiry, and his ideas continue to provoke thought and inspire debate in the modern world. However, it is essential to recognize that, like all great thinkers, Plato's ideas were not without their limitations, contradictions, or controversial aspects. His contributions to philosophy and politics remain powerful, but they are not exempt from scrutiny. By examining the lasting impact of Plato's ideas, both the good and the problematic, we can better understand the enduring complexity of his intellectual legacy. At the heart of Plato's philosophy is his theory of the forms, which is often seen as one of his most profound and influential ideas. The theory posits that the physical world we experience through our senses is not the ultimate reality. Instead, it is a mere reflection or shadow of a higher, perfect realm of unchanging, eternal forms. These forms represent the true essence of all things, and our world is filled with imperfect copies of these ideal versions. The form of beauty, for example, is an ideal standard that transcends the beautiful objects we encounter in the world. The theory of forms suggests that knowledge and truth are not found in the mutable world of appearances, but in the timeless, perfect forms that can only be apprehended through reason and intellect. While the theory of forms was groundbreaking, it was also controversial. Many philosophers, including Plato's own student Aristotle, rejected the notion of separate, perfect forms existing apart from the physical world. Aristotle argued that forms were not separate from things themselves, but rather inherent in the objects we experience. Nonetheless, Plato's theory of forms laid the groundwork for much of Western metaphysical thought and has continued to spark debate for over 2 millennia. It raises fundamental questions about the nature of reality, knowledge, and perception, questions that remain at the core of philosophical inquiry to this day. In addition to his metaphysical contributions, Plato's political thought was equally groundbreaking. His work on justice, governance, and the ideal society, particularly in the Republic, provided a model for how philosophers might think about the structure of society. Plato proposed a vision of the ideal state, one in which society was governed by philosopher-kings, rulers who, through their knowledge of the forms, were best suited to lead justly and wisely. He argued that, just as a craftsman needs expertise in their trade to excel, a ruler must possess deep knowledge of truth and justice to govern effectively. For Plato, justice was not simply a matter of laws and rules. It was the alignment of each individual's soul with the larger cosmic order of the forms. His vision of a harmonious society, in which each class, producers, warriors, and rulers, plays its proper role, was an attempt to create a system where the well-being of the whole was prioritized over individual self-interest. Plato's political ideas continue to resonate today, influencing political theory, ethical philosophy, and even contemporary discussions of governance and justice. His vision of a society led by philosopher-kings, rulers guided by wisdom and truth rather than power or wealth provides an ideal that has inspired countless political theorists and thinkers. Plato's commitment to justice as an ultimate good remains a powerful foundation for political discourse, one that urges leaders to seek the truth and act in the best interests of society, rather than pursuing personal gain. His ideas also laid the groundwork for later discussions of democracy, meritocracy, and the role of knowledge in governance. However, as much as Plato's political vision has been admired, it has also faced considerable criticism. His idea of philosopher-kings, while noble in theory, raises troubling questions about the nature of power, freedom, and inequality. Plato's ideal rulers were not elected, and their power was absolute, granted to them on the basis of their wisdom and understanding of the forms. This raises concerns about authoritarianism and the concentration of power in the hands of a small elite, a critique that resonates with modern democratic values. Plato's utopia is structured around rigid class divisions: producers, warriors, and rulers, and these divisions are justified by the idea that people's roles are determined by their natural abilities and qualities. While Plato believed that society would function best if individuals adhered to their predetermined roles, this raises questions about individual freedom and social mobility. Plato's system seems to dismiss the possibility of personal agency and self-determination, instead favoring a strict hierarchy that limits opportunities for social and political change. Moreover, Plato's idea of the noble lie, which he proposed as a tool to maintain social harmony, introduces a morally troubling element to his political philosophy. According to Plato, rulers should deceive the population into believing that their social roles are determined by the composition of their souls. Some are born with gold in their souls, some with silver, and some with bronze. This myth, Plato argued, would ensure that people accept their place in society without questioning the system. While Plato believed the noble lie was necessary for the greater good, it has been criticized as a dangerous justification for manipulation and deceit. The idea that the rulers of society should manipulate the truth for the benefit of the state has been used to justify authoritarian regimes and propaganda throughout history. Plato's willingness to accept the use of deception in the service of social stability raises ethical concerns about the relationship between truth, power, and justice. Additionally, Plato's views on women were inconsistent and, in some cases, deeply problematic. While he made important strides toward gender equality in his vision of the ideal society, arguing that women were just as capable as men of ruling and participating in public life, his other writings reveal a more regressive attitude toward women. In some dialogues, Plato described women as inherently weaker and less rational than men, subscribing to the widely held belief of his time that women were biologically inferior. He also endorsed the ancient idea that women's wombs were wandering animals, capable of causing mental and physical illness. These views were not only damaging to women's social standing, but they also reinforced the patriarchal norms that existed in Greek society. Plato's conflicting views on women suggest that even a philosopher as visionary as he could not entirely escape the biases and limitations of his time. Despite these flaws, Plato's work on ethics, knowledge, and the soul has had a lasting impact on Western philosophy. His conception of the soul as having three parts: reason, spirit, and appetite has influenced later theories of human nature, particularly in psychology and ethics. Plato's emphasis on the importance of reason and intellectual virtue in achieving a just life laid the groundwork for much of Western ethical thought. His belief that knowledge is not simply a matter of sensory experience but requires intellectual contemplation and understanding of the higher truths also continues to shape philosophical discussions about the nature of knowledge and perception. In the end, Plato's legacy is one of both remarkable insight and troubling contradiction. His theory of the forms, his vision of a just society, and his exploration of the nature of the soul and knowledge have shaped the trajectory of Western thought in profound ways. Yet, his flaws, particularly his inconsistent views on women, his acceptance of the noble lie, and the authoritarian implications of his political system remind us that even the greatest thinkers are products of their time. Plato's ideas, while revolutionary in many respects, must be understood within the context of the historical and cultural limitations that shaped them. His work is a powerful reminder of both the potential and the limits of human reason. The enduring relevance of Plato's philosophy lies in its ability to provoke deep reflection on the nature of reality, justice, and the human condition. While his political system may seem outdated and impractical by modern standards, the questions he raised about the role of reason in governance, the pursuit of justice, and the nature of knowledge continue to resonate. Plato's mixed legacy, one of brilliance and flawed assumptions, reminds us of the complexity of intellectual history and the ongoing process of refining, critiquing, and building upon the ideas of the past. His work remains a vital part of philosophical inquiry, offering both inspiration and cautionary lessons for those who seek to understand the world and our place within it. As we come to the end of our exploration of Plato's ideas, it's clear that his work still holds a remarkable influence on the way we think today. Whether you agree with his conclusions or not, there's no denying that Plato was a thinker ahead of his time. His theories about the nature of reality, the structure of society, and the pursuit of knowledge continue to serve as both a foundation for modern philosophy and a source of ongoing debate. As we've seen, Plato's ideas offer us much to admire, but they also leave us with important questions that challenge the assumptions of his time and our own. When we engage with Plato's philosophy, we're not just learning about the ancient world, we're engaging in the very kind of philosophical inquiry he valued. Plato didn't expect us to accept his ideas without question. Rather, he wanted us to use reason, dialogue, and careful thought to test and refine his arguments. And that's what we've done today. We've examined Plato's theories, looked at their strengths and weaknesses, and considered their relevance in our own lives. In doing so, we're following the very path of intellectual exploration that Plato set out for us over 2,000 years ago. It's easy to get caught up in the aspects of Plato's philosophy that we find problematic, such as his inconsistent views on women or his belief in the noble lie. These ideas are troubling, and rightfully so. But the true value of engaging with Plato's work isn't about uncritically accepting everything he said, it's about using his ideas as a stepping stone for further reflection. Plato may have lived in a very different time, with different cultural norms and values, but his work remains a powerful tool for thinking critically about the world around us. By questioning Plato's assumptions, by scrutinizing his political visions, and by challenging his views on human nature, we're doing exactly what he would have encouraged us to do, engaging in the practice of philosophy. Philosophy isn't just about finding answers, it's about asking the right questions and being open to new ways of thinking. And as we ask those questions, we continue the conversation that Plato started long ago. In fact, when we criticize his ideas, we're participating in the very process of intellectual growth that he promoted. What's fascinating about Plato's philosophy is that it provides a kind of mirror for our own thinking. His theories force us to confront deep questions about the nature of knowledge, reality, and justice, questions that remain just as relevant today as they were in ancient Athens. His work asks us to consider what it means to live a good life, to understand the truth, and to create a society that is just. And while we may not always agree with Plato's conclusions, his ideas still push us to think about these big questions in a way that challenges our assumptions and expands our minds. Plato's work also has a remarkable ability to remain relevant. Even as society changes, his ideas have influenced centuries of thinkers, from the medieval scholastics to modern political theorists and beyond. And while we may not agree with all of his views, we can still learn from the way he approached problems. His ability to explore abstract concepts with such rigor, to create systems of thought that invite both analysis and critique, continues to inspire new generations of thinkers. The fact that his ideas still spark conversation today is a testament to their lasting power. But the real power of Plato's philosophy lies in its potential for personal and intellectual growth. Plato didn't just want us to accept his ideas, he wanted us to think for ourselves. His dialogues are meant to inspire us to question, to analyze, and to refine our own understanding of the world. So when we engage with his work, we're not just learning about his views, we're learning how to think more deeply, more critically, and more thoughtfully about the world around us. In that sense, Plato's philosophy isn't just about the past, it's about the present and the future, about how we continue to build on the ideas of the past while challenging them and refining our understanding of the world. As we reflect on Plato's ideas, it's important to recognize that we don't have to agree with everything he said to appreciate the depth of his thought. His philosophy is an invitation to think for ourselves, to challenge assumptions, and to engage in the ongoing process of intellectual discovery. The fact that we can look at Plato's work critically, that we can debate his ideas, and that we can continue to draw inspiration from his philosophy speaks to the enduring value of his intellectual legacy. In a world where so much of our thinking is shaped by outside forces, Plato's philosophy reminds us of the power of independent thought and the importance of questioning the status quo. If Plato teaches us anything, it's that philosophy is not about having all the answers, it's about continually searching for better questions. It's about being open to new ideas, challenging old assumptions, and embracing the complexity of the world around us. And in that process, we grow not just as individuals, but as a society. Plato's ideas provide a rich landscape for this kind of intellectual exploration. His work is a treasure trove of insights and challenges, an invitation to keep thinking, keep questioning, and keep growing. So, if you've enjoyed this deep dive into Plato's philosophy and found yourself inspired to think more critically about the world, then we'd love for you to continue the journey with us. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel so that you can stay updated on all our future videos. We have many more thought-provoking discussions coming your way, diving into the ideas of some of history's greatest thinkers and exploring the questions that continue to shape our world. Your support helps us bring more content like this to the world, and it also allows you to be part of a community that values thoughtful discussion, intellectual curiosity, and the pursuit of knowledge. If you're passionate about philosophy or just curious to learn more, subscribing to our channel is the best way to stay connected. We're always ready to take on the next big question, explore a new philosophical concept, or dive into the ideas that have shaped the course of history. By subscribing, you're not just getting access to our content, you're becoming part of a community of thinkers who are dedicated to exploring the big ideas that continue to shape our world. If you found this video thought-provoking, why not share it with your friends? You never know, something we discussed here today could spark a conversation that leads to new insights or perspectives. Sharing this video is a great way to get your friends, family, and colleagues involved in a discussion about the ideas that matter most. Who knows? Maybe a conversation about Plato's philosophy could change the way someone thinks, just like it has for centuries. Lastly, don't forget to hit the notification bell so you'll never miss a new video. We're constantly uploading fresh content that digs deep into philosophy, history, politics, and more. If you want to stay up to date on all the latest videos and join us as we explore the big questions, be sure to subscribe and click the bell to get notified whenever we release something new. Thank you for taking the time to watch and reflect with us. Plato's ideas, like all great philosophical work, are meant to provoke thought, spark conversation, and inspire deeper engagement with the world around us. We hope this video has done that for you. Until next time, keep questioning, keep thinking, and keep exploring the ideas that shape our lives.